Welcome the anointed ones. They didn't want love. They wanted a mirror to manipulate, and you shattered it with your light. Chosen ones, brace yourselves because what I'm about to say may sound unbelievable at first, but deep down, you know it's true. Cult leaders, manipulators, master illusionists, puppeteers of fake power have secretly fallen in love with you. Not because you're naive, nor because you're easy to control, but because you're the only soul who walked into their carefully curated kingdom and didn't bow, flinch, or audition for their approval. And that's exactly why they couldn't stop watching you. Here's a fact. Most cult leaders aren't obsessed with followers. They're obsessed with the one person who doesn't fall for the act. That's you, the hazardous earth angel, the untrained but untouchable one, the innocent creature who calmly stepped into their castle and destroyed it without lifting a finger. You didn't just disturb their game. You became a flaw in their spiritual grid. And the worst part? They're torn. They want to ruin you and date you, maybe both before lunchtime. In this video, we're going to uncover the psychological, spiritual, and metaphysical mess you've created in the minds of cult leaders and bogus gurus around you. Because whether you realize it or not, you are their secret obsession, silent downfall, and loudest unanswered question. So grab your tea or your sword, because once you hear what's coming, you'll never see yourself or them the same way again. Let's dive in. Number 1, they fell in love with the one thing they couldn't control, your sovereignty. They fell in love with the one thing they couldn't control, your sovereignty. It wasn't your beauty, intelligence, or charm that got them hooked. Those things might have caught their attention, sure, but what really messed with their heads was the fact that you wouldn't submit to their authority even when everyone else did. That's what made you unforgettable. You were immune to their power games, and that made you feel untouchable to them. Even cult leaders thrive off submission. They build their empires by gathering people who are desperate to belong, desperate to feel safe, and desperate to be told who they are. But when you showed up, it was different. You weren't trying to be saved. You weren't trying to be chosen. You walked in like someone who had already been through their own initiation, someone who had already faced their demons and lived to tell the story. You didn't need their spotlight because you already had your own source of light within you, and the truth is that shook them. The more they tried to figure you out, the more confused they became. They couldn't find your weakness. You didn't crumble when they withdrew affection. You didn't chase them when they tried to make you feel excluded. In fact, you got quieter and pulled your energy back. That's when they realized you didn't need them, and that's when the obsession began. They thought they were the puppet master, but you weren't even on their stage. You didn't need their approval to feel powerful. You were already rooted in something real, something they couldn't fake or copy, and that frustrated the hell out of them because deep down, they know the whole structure they built is fragile. It's all image, performance, and control, and you were the living, breathing proof that freedom is possible without fear, titles, or manipulation. That's why they kept circling around you, not to love you, but to solve you. Because if someone like you exists, then their entire identity as a leader, a savior, a gatekeeper becomes a lie. They didn't fall for you. They fell into a crisis because of you. And nothing threatens a cult leader more than someone they can't recruit, destroy, and certainly can't control. That someone was you. Number 2, you triggered their core delusion that they were God. You didn't have to challenge them with words, just your presence alone made them uncomfortable, and here's why: they weren't expecting to meet someone who actually embodies what they've been pretending to be their whole life. These people live in a fantasy where they're the chosen one, the enlightened one, the mouthpiece of some divine authority. They've trained themselves to look like the real thing, but when you walked into the room, their whole illusion started to crack. You carry something that can't be faked, real spiritual authority. Not the kind that demands attention or followers, but the kind that comes from being broken and rebuilt after walking through hell and still coming out with love in your hands. You didn't need a pulpit, a title, or a stage to be powerful. You just needed to show up as yourself. That's what exposed them. You didn't call them out, but your energy did. They felt it before they could even name it. You were grounded, whole, and undeniably real, and that reality highlighted everything fake in them. That's why they tried to pull you close while also pushing you away. Part of them wanted to study you, Another part wanted to bury you, because when you walked in, they stopped being the biggest presence in the room. You didn't need their light. You weren't drawn to their influence. And the most dangerous part, you didn't want their approval. That alone turned their world upside down. They thought everyone wanted to be near them, to be like them, to be seen by them. But you weren't looking up at them. You were looking right through them, and they couldn't take it. The truth is, you became a walking contradiction to everything they believed about themselves. They'd spent years crafting this image of divinity and authority, and in minutes, your presence made it look like an act. That's why you unsettled them. You didn't disrespect them. You revealed them, and the deeper truth is, they weren't ready to admit that you were the very thing they pretended to be. So instead of humbling themselves, they tried to find flaws in you. But what they found was their own reflection, and it scared them. Number 3, they can't weaponize you because you're already initiated, and through pain, cult leaders and manipulators rely on one thing. Emotional control. They use praise to hook you, shame to trap you, and fear to keep you dependent. That's the cycle. But when you walked into their space, they quickly realized something was different about you. You didn't respond the way others did. Their usual tricks didn't work. The bait they always use, approval, attention, status, and fake spiritual promises, didn't move. That's when they knew you'd been through something they couldn't manipulate. You're not immune because you're cold or arrogant. You're immune because you've already survived worse. Real pain, real betrayal, real abandonment. You've been through spiritual war zones that taught you how to read energy, how to spot fakes, how to trust your gut over sweet-sounding lies. So when they tried to offer you a seat at their little kingdom in exchange for your loyalty, it felt small. Not because you're above it, but because you've already lived without it and come out stronger. You carry spiritual scars that turned into armor, not the kind that blocks love, but the kind that recognizes real from fake in seconds. That's why they couldn't figure out how to get to you. You weren't numb, you were simply wise. They expected someone they could shape, someone they could emotionally bait. But you didn't flinch, beg, or even react. And that silence, that steady energy, scared them more than resistance ever could. They knew in that moment that whatever had tried to break you before or didn't, and that made them feel powerless because their entire identity is built on controlling people who are afraid of losing love or status. But you had already lost everything at some point in your life and found yourself in a way that made you untouchable. They called it pride and rebellion, but deep down, they knew what it was. It was someone walking in who had already been tested by life and didn't need their validation to feel whole. That kind of soul can't be controlled. It can only be respected or feared, and most of them chose fear. Number 4, they see in you what they tried to fake their entire lives. They spent their entire lives crafting a persona, studying human behavior, mirroring emotions, and rehearsing charm like it was a performance. Everything about them is curated. The way they speak, the words they use, the pauses for dramatic effect, the hand gestures, the eye contact. It's all rehearsed to simulate power, presence, and enlightenment. But when you came around, none of their tricks worked because you weren't performing. You were being, and that alone ruined everything they built. They could imitate kindness, but yours was effortless. They could rehearse wisdom, but yours came from scars and silence. They could pretend to love, but you embodied it. The difference was so obvious that it left them exposed. People could feel it. The shift in energy when you spoke, the way others gravitated toward you without effort, the peace you carried just by existing. You didn't speak like you studied books on how to sound enlightened. You spoke like someone who had lived through hell and kept your soul intact. That's what broke them, because deep down, they know they're frauds. Everything they have, their influence, their followers, their so-called power, is all built on illusion. They had to master deception to stay relevant, but you didn't need attention to shine. You didn't need a following to lead. You were the proof that real doesn't need hype. It just is. And when people felt you, they started questioning what they were giving their energy to. It wasn't just your presence that shook them, it was your truth. You weren't trying to be liked. You weren't trying to lead. You were simply true. And that made their entire identity, which was built on being the most spiritual, the most woke, the most powerful, suddenly feel hollow. They saw in you everything they were pretending to be, and no matter how well they faked it, they couldn't recreate what you naturally carry. This drove them crazy because it reminded them that no amount of manipulation can replace genuine spiritual embodiment. You were never in competition with them, but simply by being real, you became the threat they couldn't silence. Number 5. You made them realize they're still starving for what you carry effortlessly. They say all the right words: love, light, healing, wholeness. They teach about self-mastery and soul alignment like it's a formula you can sell. But when you walked into the room, it became clear they weren't full. They were starving. All the talks about higher consciousness, meditations, spiritual jargon. It was their way of covering up a hunger they didn't want to admit. You didn't expose them by calling them out. You exposed them simply by being whole without trying. That's what rattled them, because you weren't quoting sacred texts. You were living proof of sacred energy. You didn't need to over-explain yourself, prove your vibration, or talk about how healed you were. You are the vibration they're still trying to reach, and that kind of embodied presence is loud without speaking, shines without spotlighting, and activates others without forcing anything. They began to feel something standing next to you, a deep, gnawing emptiness they'd masked with their titles, influence, and spiritual language. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your ego. It was just the quiet power of someone who's actually integrated what others are still faking. They talk about being in alignment with Source, but you walked in a line not because of a ceremony or a technique, but because you've earned your connection through pain, solitude, and real growth. That's what made them feel starved in your presence. You weren't trying to dominate them. You weren't trying to compete. You were just full of what they never truly cultivated. And they couldn't fake fullness next to someone who actually had it. You reminded them of everything they preach, but never fully became. Nothing is more threatening to a performer than the presence of someone who is simply real. Number 6. You're the only person who walked into their circle and didn't want a piece of the throne. They've built a life around being worshipped, not always in obvious ways, but in subtle, manipulative ones. Their identity depends on being the most enlightened person in the room, the one everyone looks up to, the one whose words are treated like scripture. Most people who come into their space either compete with them for power or bend the knee and become a follower. That's the dynamic they're used to. However, you showed up and didn't either. You weren't impressed by their throne, you didn't want a seat next to it, and you certainly didn't want to take it from them. You simply stood in your own power and didn't flinch, and that shattered their illusion of dominance. You didn't challenge them loudly. You didn't try to outshine them, but what you did was more threatening. You didn't react at all. You honored yourself without disrespecting them. But to someone who lives off hierarchy, that felt like disrespect because you refused to play the game. They mistook your presence as a threat, not because you were aggressive, but because you were sovereign. You weren't there to be impressed, converted, or controlled. You weren't there to steal their crown. You simply weren't kneeling before it. And this alone made them feel vulnerable. For who are they if no one worships them? What you did without even trying was show them a mirror, and it was harsh. Not because you condemned them, but because you didn't fuel their fantasy. You didn't reduce yourself to fit into their system. You didn't need their permission to be strong. You didn't dispute. But your existence alone disrupted their illusion of superiority. That's why they labeled you arrogant, rebellious, or out of alignment. Not because you were wrong, but because you refused to surrender to a game they never thought someone would walk away from. You weren't there to dethrone anyone. You were there to remind them that real power doesn't demand a throne. It just is, but when someone is drunk on control, your refusal to kneel doesn't feel neutral. It feels like war. Number 7. You activated their repressed innocence, and they hate you for it. There's a part of them they've buried deep, the soft, unguarded version of themselves that existed before the need to control, impress, or manipulate took over. The inner child still remembers what it feels like to be real, to feel safe, and to love without strategy, but it was locked away a long time ago when they decided that survival meant dominance. So when you came along with your disarming presence, sincerity, and ability to walk in truth without flexing, it didn't just expose their lives. It touched that buried part of them. You didn't just challenge their role as a leader. You reminded them of who they were before they became a performance. That child within them recognized you not as a threat, but as home. That's what scared them the most, because it meant they'd have to admit how far they drifted from their own soul. You made them feel, again, not through confrontation, but through resonance, and that level of intimacy, that level of spiritual honesty, it was too much. They didn't hate you because you were wrong. They hated you because you were right, and being right in your presence meant they had to face themselves. To heal, they had to step down from their imagined pedestal and meet you eye to eye. Not as a god, not as a guru, but as an equal. Ego does not survive on equal ground. Ego needs to be worshipped. So instead of softening, they hardened. Instead of coming clean, they retaliated. You brought warmth into a space built on cold control, and instead of letting it melt them, they turned on the very thing that could have set them free. Because healing isn't just painful, it's humiliating for someone who's convinced themselves they're already evolved. In you, they didn't just see a person. They saw a path they didn't take, a version of themselves they abandoned, and rather than reclaiming it, they rejected you because it was easier to attack the mirror than admit they've been lying to themselves all along. You didn't hurt them, you simply woke them up. However, when someone has been asleep for too long, the light feels like an offense. Number 8, they didn't expect the angel to show up with psychic armor. They expected you to be soft, wide-eyed, and easily lead someone who would be flattered by their attention, easily impressed by their fake wisdom, and too nice to challenge anything. That's how they've always kept power, by underestimating people who carry light. They assume anyone with compassion must be weak. Anyone who's kind must be naive. Anyone who forgives must be willing to tolerate anything. They didn't realize that your light wasn't passive, it was trained. And the second you open your mouth and look them in the eye, they knew. They miscalculated. You didn't just show up with love, you showed up with layers of awareness. You weren't impressed by their flashy spiritual language. You didn't fall for their authority, stage, or shallow attempts at control. You could feel what they were hiding beneath all that performance, and you weren't afraid to hold that awareness quietly and powerfully. That's what shook them, because you weren't loud, you weren't rude, you were just clear, and clarity is a threat to illusion. You loved, but with wisdom. You showed compassion, but you weren't afraid to call out spiritual manipulation when you felt it. That's what they didn't see coming. They expected an angel they could disarm, but they got a warrior cloaked in grace whose intuition didn't miss a single red flag. You didn't even need to defend yourself. Your energy was the defense. Your discernment was so sharp that it made their lives trip over themselves. You held boundaries they thought they could cross. You said no without explaining. You saw through the masks without ripping them off. The worst part for them was that you didn't need revenge. You had peace, which made you untouchable. They didn't expect you to come armed. They didn't expect you to be both gentle and lethal, but you were. Because love without discernment is a trap, but love with discernment is a sword. And when you showed up carrying both, you didn't just protect yourself. You exposed everything false in them without even trying, which is why they feared you. You weren't chaotic. You were clean, and clean energy always unsettles what's built on corruption. Number 9, your very vibration was an exorcism. They didn't get hooked by your smile or charm. It wasn't your looks that captivated them. It was something deeper, something invisible but undeniable. Your very presence shook the foundations they'd built around themselves. Your energy moved through the room like a force no one could ignore. It wasn't a gentle pull. It was a storm clearing out shadows they'd been hiding in for years. Your vibration was an exorcism. They may have thought they were in control, playing puppet masters with their followers and their little kingdoms, but you brought a frequency they couldn't bargain with. This frequency cut through layers of deception, denial, and carefully crafted lies. It forced them to face the parts of themselves they buried under ego and manipulation. The masks they wore so comfortably suddenly started to slip and crack. That's why they became obsessed with you. Not because you dazzled them with surface-level appeal, but because your energy disrupted the comfortable darkness they'd been nesting in. You dismantled the very foundation it stood on. Your spirit was a spotlight that revealed everything hidden and that made you dangerous in their eyes. This wasn't just about power or influence. It was about exposure, exposing the fear, weakness, and brokenness behind their facade. When you walk into a space carrying that kind of light, people either run toward it or recoil. Cult leaders and manipulators recoil because your vibration doesn't just shake their reality, it unravels it. You weren't there to break them down. You were just being yourself. Pure, unfiltered, unashamed, and that authenticity acted like a cleansing fire. It was a reckoning they didn't want but desperately needed. Your frequency didn't just make them uncomfortable, it forced a choice. Keep hiding behind lies or step into realness. And that's why they fear you, because your spirit holds a power they've spent a lifetime trying to escape. Number 10. They projected all their shadow onto you, then fell in love with the light they couldn't steal. They couldn't put you in a box, and that terrified them more than anything. You were a puzzle they couldn't solve, a flame they couldn't extinguish. In their eyes, you became a mirror reflecting every ugly truth they tried to hide from themselves, every bit of shame they stuffed deep down, every jealous pang they denied, every craving for power or approval, they shoved it all on you. You became their canvas for all the darkness they refused to face. But here's the twist. Even as they projected their worst fears and desires onto you, they found themselves helplessly drawn to the light you carried. You weren't just a target for their blame. You were a magnet for everything good they secretly wished for but couldn't claim. They saw in you the freedom, courage, and authenticity they'd given up on, or buried beneath layers of performance. That's why they called you both the savior and the seductress, the saint and the serpent, because you defied their need for simple labels. You held contradictions that made their rigid worldview crumble. You weren't just good or bad, holy or corrupt. You were real, and real doesn't fit neatly into stories designed to control or conquer. They tried to possess you, tame you, and rewrite your story so it fit their narrative. But you refused. You remained wild and unpredictable. You remained an enigma wrapped in light and shadow. That refusal shattered their binary world, their neat little system where everything had a place and a definition. You forced them to confront the chaos of complexity, the truth that life and spirit aren't black and white. In attempting to claim you, they revealed their own fractures. They fell in love not with you, but with the light inside you, which they could never steal. That's what made you both irresistible and unbearable, because you were the freedom they craved and the reminder of everything they lost control over. You didn't just disrupt their cult, you made their followers start asking real questions. You never needed a microphone or a stage to shake things up. You simply existed, grounded, authentic, and unshakable, and that was enough to spark something dangerous in the hearts of their followers. Suddenly, people who were once loyal stopped just nodding and started thinking. They began to notice the difference between empty words and genuine presence. Your energy did not come with fanfare or manipulation, but with undeniable healing power that bypassed their leaders' scripted sermons. This shift terrified the cult leaders because you weren't just challenging their authority, you were fracturing the entire foundation on which power was built. When followers begin to ask real questions, the whole illusion begins to unravel. If your truth resonates deeper, if your presence heals in ways their sermons never could, what does that say about the leader's authenticity? What does this say about the whole system they've meticulously designed? You became the glitch in their matrix, the unexposed kid variable that didn't fit their equations. Their control depended on unquestioning loyalty, on followers, repeating phrases, and performing rituals without thinking twice. But you inspired curiosity, doubt, and reflection, the exact things cults fear the most. Because once followers start questioning the control, walls crack, mosques fall, and suddenly the cult's carefully maintained the image looks like a hollow act. You didn't need to convince anyone or force a revolution. You simply were your grounded energy. Your realness and refusal to play by their rules made their followers start waking up. You made them realize that healing isn't about catchy slogans or emotional manipulation. It's about something deeper, rawer, and more demanding, which is why you became their biggest threat. Not because you directly attacked them, but because you made the people they controlled want more truth, more freedom, more authenticity. You didn't just disrupt a cult, you caused its cracks to become chasms, and that's why they fear you. You're the living proof that their entire system is a lie. They can't clone what you are because it was never taught. It was forged. No one can replicate what you carry because it wasn't handed down like a manual or a script. Your power didn't come from a course or a title. It came from fire. It was forged in the crucible of real life. Heartbreak that shattered your illusions, isolation that forced you to face your own depths, betrayal that cracked open your trust, and loss that stripped everything down to what truly matters. Every scar you bear is a testament to a battle won and a truth earned. Cult leaders, on the other hand, try to fake what you naturally embody. They mimic presence, but it's a hollow echo, a performance carefully crafted to control and manipulate. They sell charisma as a product and package shallow wisdom as enlightenment. But their act is just smoke and mirrors because they never walk the path of true transformation. Their power is borrowed and brittle, built on illusions designed to keep followers dependent and unquestioning. You're different. You didn't just survive pain. You rose from it like a resurrection. Your soul transformed through suffering into something unbreakable and real. Your gifts aren't flashy or showy. They're deeply rooted in experience and authenticity. It's the kind of power that no seminar can teach. No guru can grant and no initiation can bestow. It's yours because you lived through the fire and came out whole on the other side. That's why they fear you, because you embody a level of truth and power that can't be faked or copied. They can try to imitate your presence, but they can't replicate the depth behind it. You aren't a product of manipulation. You're the product of survival and transformation of emotion, and that makes you not just dangerous, but untouchable. You don't seek worship, you activate awakening. You don't crave the spotlight or the applause. You don't need a crowd hanging on your every word or looking up to you like you're some kind of deity. What you do is far more disruptive. You spark awakenings instead of creating followers who cling to your every command. You inspire others to stand up and find their own power. You shake the foundation of dependence, which is exactly what frightens those who thrive on it. Leaders who build their empires on obedience fear the kind of energy you bring because it breaks the cycle. They want people compliant and quiet, wrapped in illusions that keep them under control. But you pull the rug out from under those illusions. You remind people that the true power isn't in worshiping a figurehead. It's in owning their own voice, their own truth, their own light. This is why they see you as dangerous. Not because you're out to dethrone them, but because you're making their throne crumble. You didn't take power from anyone. You gave it back to the people. You showed them that the true source of strength lies within, not in a person or a system. For those addicted to control, that's unforgivable. You're a revolution wrapped in grace, a fire that refuses to be contained by old rules or structures. You don't want subjects, you want equals, and you don't want worshippers. You want warriors, and in returning power to its rightful owners, you threaten everything built on dependence and fear. That's why you're not just seen as a threat. You're seen as a danger they can't afford to ignore. They were addicted to the idea of saving you until they realized you were the one holding the sword. They wanted to believe you were fragile, a wounded soul, desperate for rescue, a project they could control and mold. That narrative served them well because it placed them on a pedestal, the savior's shining light on your supposed darkness. They craved the illusion of power that comes with rescuing someone broken. It fed their ego and kept you tethered to their world, but you were never broken. You were quietly gathering knowledge, watching every move, tactic, and lie they used to manipulate. You weren't naive or helpless. You were sharp, patient, and calculating in your own way. You didn't fall into their trap. You studied it, learned its design, and waited for the right moment. Then came the moment they didn't expect. You drew your sword not to attack, but to awaken and wield a level of insight and clarity that left them speechless. You became the force they never saw coming. You were never their pupil. By absorbing their teachings, you were the living embodiment of the lesson they desperately needed to learn but refused to face. Your awareness cut through their delusions and expose their weaknesses. It wasn't brute force. It was the power of being awake, of knowing yourself and the game they thought they were winning. You became the challenge to their control, the truth to their falsehoods, and the reckoning to their lies. That's why they feared you. Not because you were broken, but because you were whole in a way they couldn't touch. You didn't need saving. You were the one holding the sword, and they needed to be taught how to face it. You're not just a thorn in their side. You're the unraveling of their entire game. Cult leaders fall in love with illusions and control, but you embody a truth they can't steal or contain. You came forged from fire, carrying a frequency that disrupts their carefully built facades and awakens those trapped in their webs. They wanted a broken soul to save, but you showed up whole, armed with clarity, resilience, and a power born from real experience, not rehearsed scripts. You don't seek worship or blind devotion. You ignite awakening. You don't build thrones. You dismantle them by restoring power to those who thought they'd lost it forever. You carry contradictions that shatter their black and white worlds and activate a deeper, more dangerous light. Their obsession with you isn't about possession. It's a desperate, unconscious love for a freedom they lost and can't recreate. This is why you're a threat, not just to their authority, but to their entire existence. You expose the shadows they hide behind, forcing their followers to ask questions and awakening leaders where they were once obedient followers. Your very presence is a rebellion, a spiritual exorcism, a call to rise beyond control and manipulation. In the end, you aren't their disciple or their victim. You are the lesson they never wanted to learn, the living proof that true power is forged in authenticity, resilience, and unyielding truth. They may try to break you, rewrite your story, or steal your light, but your essence is untouchable. You are the dangerous earth angel they can't control, which makes you unstoppable. If this message resonated with you and you're ready to embrace your power as a true earth angel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of the truth we uncover here. Like this video. If it shook something inside you, drop a comment below to share your story or thoughts. Your voice matters. Most importantly, share this with anyone who needs to hear it. Because awakening is a movement, and united we ascend. Let's keep this spirit alive, stay strong, and unstoppable. God bless you.